everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going deep on superstitions.
Ooh, fun.
Yeah, this should be interesting. We've got some excerpts from a Korean source called Superstition, Between Rationality and Belief. And, yeah, like we always do, we're going to try to break it down and figure out what's really important for you.
Definitely. I think it's going to be super interesting to look at this from a Korean perspective, too. Superstitions are so universal.
Right.
You find them in every culture. But seeing how another culture like Korea thinks about them can give us a new lens to look at our own.
Totally. So, first off, how does this source even define superstition?
Okay, so they define it as the effort or habit of seeking a causal relationship between two events, situations, or practices whose causal relationship is not rationally confirmed.
Rationally confirmed, huh? But isn't that kind of subjective?
Oh, absolutely.
What seems rational to one person might seem totally crazy to someone else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a key point that the source brings up. They emphasize that what we consider rational is influenced by so many things, our background, our experiences. So it makes sense that there's no one-size-fits-all definition of what is or isn't a superstition.
And they also mention how superstitions are often beliefs held by like tons of people over long periods of time.
Right.
What's the significance of that?
Well, I think it makes it even more interesting.
Yeah.
You know, if a belief survives for generations, it makes you wonder why. Does it tap into some kind of deep human fear or need or...
Right. It's like those dreams that feel prophetic.
Oh, yeah.
You wake up and you're like, wait, was that just a dream or was that telling me something?
Totally. Dreams are a great example of how that line between the mental and the physical can get all blurry, you know. The source even talks about taemon, which are Korean prophetic dreams about pregnancy. They say there might be a connection to reality, but there's still so much we don't know about how the mind works.
It really makes you think about like the power of the mind, right?
Yeah.
So does the source talk about other ways that what we consider superstitious can change over time?
They do. They talk about shamanism in Korea as an example.
Okay.
It used to be the dominant worldview, but over time, as Christianity spread, it kind of pushed to the margins and labeled as superstition.
Interesting.
So it shows how what's considered rational or irrational really depends on the culture and the time period.
Like yesterday's truth is today's superstition.
Right, like a big cultural game of telephone.
That's a great way to put it. But you know, it's not all serious stuff, right?
Oh, definitely not.
The source also has some pretty fun and relatable stories about superstitions from around the world.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, did you know, in Germany, if you don't make eye contact when you clink glasses for a toast, it's supposed to lead to 7 years of bad sex.
7 years. I'm never looking away again.
Right. Better safe than sorry. And then in Thailand, they believe that you shouldn't cry at funerals.
Oh, wow.
The idea is that your tears might make the deceased spirit cling to sorrow.
Interesting. That's so different from the Korean tradition, where they really encourage you to wail and express your grief openly.
Right. It's fascinating how different cultures deal with death and what they believe happens afterwards.
Totally. And speaking of different cultures, if you ever find yourself in Mongolia.
Oh, Mongolia.
Yeah. Any tips for avoiding bad luck there?
Okay, well, first of all, never lean against the central pillar of a gurgur. Yeah, it's their traditional tent, and whatever you do, don't hit a dog.
Okay.
They're seen as protectors. For good luck, though, make sure you circle an ovu 3 times.
An ovu? What's that?
It's a stone cairn. Or if you're driving, you can just honk your horn 3 times.
Okay, so no leaning, no dog hitting, and lots of 3s. Got it.
Exactly.
So we've talked about some fun travel superstitions, but the source also gets into some pretty heavy historical examples, too. Like they talk about this king's touch thing in Europe.
Oh, yeah, the king's touch. That's a fascinating one. For centuries, people believed that the king of England could cure a disease called scrofula just by touching the sick person.
Really? What's scrofula?
It's like a type of tuberculosis that affects the lymph nodes.
Okay.
And it was huge in France in the 17th century. Kings were healing like over 1,300 people a year.
Wow. That's a lot of touching. But why would people believe that? Especially in a place like Europe.
Well, back then, medical knowledge was pretty limited.
I guess so.
And the king was seen as having this divine right, you know?
Right.
So people believed he had this special healing power. And get this, the practice even continued into the 1820s.
The 1820s? But that's when modern science was starting to emerge.
I know, it's crazy, right? It really shows you how deeply ingrained some beliefs can be, even when evidence starts to contradict them.
It makes you wonder, are the things we believe in today?
Oh, totally.
That people will look back on in 100 years and be like, what were they thinking?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important to constantly question our own beliefs.
Yeah, even the ones that seem like common sense.
Exactly.
Speaking of questioning what we think we know, the source brings up a really interesting modern example. Incheon International Airport.
Oh, Incheon Airport, yeah.
You'd think a place like that would be all about logic and efficiency.
Yeah.
But even there, superstitions are at play.
It's true. Like, you won't find gates 4, 44, or 13 at Incheon.
Why not?
Well, in Korea, the number 4 is associated with death.
Oh, right.
And, of course, 13 has its own bad reputation in the West. So they just skip those numbers altogether.
It's like those superstitions, even if people don't consciously believe in them, can still influence how they design things.
Totally. And it all ties into this broader idea of numerology.
Numerology.
Yeah. You have a belief that numbers have, like, symbolic meanings.
Okay.
The source mentions how the ancient Greeks used to assign meanings to numbers based on your birth date. Oh, interesting. Like a numerology horoscope.
Exactly. It's like this ancient human desire to find patterns and meaning, even in random things like numbers.
It makes you think about all those people who see 11.11 on the clock and make a wish.
Oh, yeah, totally. Speaking of ancient desires to find meaning, the source also talks about the oracle at Delphi in ancient Greece.
Oh, yeah, the oracle at Delphi. I've always been fascinated by that.
Me too. So the omphalos...
What's the omphalos?
It's this sacred stone. It was considered to be the center of the world.
Wow.
And that's where the Pythia... Who? The Pythia. She was the oracle. She sat there to deliver prophecies.
Okay.
But here's where it gets interesting. The omphalos was located right above a fissure that emitted ethylene gas.
Wait, ethylene gas? Isn't that the stuff they use to ripen fruit?
Yep, that's the one. And exposure to it can cause hallucinations and altered states of consciousness.
So you're saying?
So it's possible that the oracle's visions, which people thought were messages from the gods, were actually caused by getting high on gas. Whoa. Talk about a buzzkill. But it's a good reminder that sometimes there's a scientific explanation for things that seem supernatural.
Totally.
Yeah.
Oh, and the source also points out this interesting contrast between how ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia approached divination.
Oh, yeah. So Egypt was all about order and stability. Their environment was pretty predictable with the Nile floods and everything. So they didn't develop these elaborate divination practices like they did in Mesopotamia.
Interesting. So why was Mesopotamia so different?
Well, their environment was much more unpredictable with floods and droughts and all sorts of natural disasters. So they were constantly trying to make sense of it all, and they came up with these really complex divination systems.
Like what kind of systems?
Oh, they would examine animal entrails, look for signs in the stars, all sorts of things.
I guess when your world feels chaotic, you try to find any way to predict what's coming next.
Exactly. It's like those travel superstitions we talked about earlier.
They probably started as practical ways to stay safe.
Right.
But then over time, they became layered with all this extra meaning.
Right, like don't lean on the Uyghur pillar because it might collapse.
Exactly.
But then it becomes don't lean on the Uyghur pillar because it's bad luck.
Right, and then it becomes a whole superstition.
Makes sense. So speaking of complex systems, the source also dives into Saju, which is a Korean fortune-telling tradition.
Saju, yes.
Yeah.
It's this really fascinating system based on the lunar calendar and the principles of yin and yang.
Yeah.
They use it for fortune-telling and stuff like that.
Interesting. So is it like astrology?
Kind of, but it's way more complex. And the source actually gets into this whole debate about whether Saju can even be considered a science.
A science? Why would it be considered a science?
So it's a systematized body of knowledge.
Yeah.
You know? It has its own internal logic and all that.
Yeah, but I thought science had to be testable and stuff.
Exactly. That's the issue. In science, you need to be able to prove something wrong. It's called falsifiability. But with Saju, a lot of the predictions are so general that you can't really prove them right or wrong.
So it's like it has its own internal logic.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily fit into our Western idea of what science is.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. And it reminds me of how even in the West,
right,
people used to believe in things like physiognomy.
Physiognomy.
Yeah, you know, like judging someone's character based on their facial feature.
Oh, yeah, like reading faces?
Right. And even big thinkers like Pythagoras and Socrates.
Yeah, right.
They were into that stuff.
It just shows you that humans have always been trying to figure out what makes people tick.
Yeah.
And sometimes we come up with some pretty wild ideas.
Absolutely. And sometimes those ideas lead to some pretty interesting phenomena. Like the source talks about this tall LG effect.
The tall LG effect. What's that?
It's this thing in Korean baseball where players who leave the LG Twins team often see a big improvement in their performance.
Oh, wow. So it's like they were cursed or something.
Well, there are some rational explanations. Like LG's home stadium is known for being huge. So when players move to teams with smaller stadiums, their home run numbers naturally go up.
Makes sense.
But hold on. The source also mentions a player who improved after transferring to another team that shares the same stadium as LG.
Oh, interesting. So it can't just be the stadium.
Right. So maybe there's something else going on, like team dynamics or coaching or even just the pressure of playing for a certain team.
It's like those haunted house shows.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a perfectly logical explanation and sometimes there's not.
It's like they always say, keep an open mind, but don't let your brains fall out.
Exactly. And speaking of sports superstitions, they're everywhere.
Oh, yeah. I have a friend who's a huge soccer fan.
Okay.
And his pregame rituals are insane. Same jersey, same seat, same snacks every single game.
It's all about trying to control the uncontrollable, right? Because in sports, there's so much that's left up to chance.
It's like they're trying to appease the sports gods.
Totally. The source even mentions how Harry Kane won't shave his beard after he scores a goal.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that. And Serena Williams always wears the same pair of socks during a tournament.
Right. It's like they found their lucky charm and they're not letting go.
It reminds me of that whole Curse of Pele thing.
Oh, yeah, Pele, the legendary soccer player.
His predictions are usually wrong.
Right.
But everyone focuses on the few times he was right.
It's classic confirmation bias. We see what we want to see.
It's like our brains are wired for a good story.
Holy.
Even if it means ignoring the facts.
Exactly. And, you know, we've been talking about these fun, harmless superstitions.
Yeah.
But the source also touches on some darker examples.
Right.
Where beliefs can have serious real-world consequences.
Like what?
Well, one example is the Four Pests campaign in China in the 1950s.
What was that?
Basically, they decided that sparrows were eating too much grain, so they launched this nationwide campaign to kill them all.
Whoa. A war on sparrows? That's intense. Did it work?
Sadly, no. It backfired spectacularly. Turns out sparrows also eat a lot of insects. So with the sparrows gone, locusts and other pests went crazy and destroyed the crops.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it led to this massive famine that killed millions of people.
That's a really sobering example of how even when people have good intentions, their actions can have unintended consequences, especially when those actions are based on flawed beliefs.
It highlights how important it is to think critically and to question information.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes from authority figures.
You can't just blindly believe everything you're told.
Right.
And speaking of questioning information, the sources also talks about this modern myth. It was popular in Korea in the 1990s.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, people believed that during the Japanese occupation, the Japanese had driven these stakes into the ground to disrupt the flow of electricity.
Wow, that's a new one.
I know, right? But researchers have debunked it.
Okay.
But some people still believe it.
It's amazing how these myths and misinformation can stick around even when there's evidence to the contrary.
It's like once a story takes hold, it's hard to get people to let go of it, especially when it's tied to historical grievances or something like that.
Totally. And, you know, it's not just in the past that we see these kinds of beliefs.
What do you mean?
Well, a source also talks about the Kumari tradition in Nepal.
The Kumari.
Yeah, it's this tradition where young girls are chosen to embody a living goddess.
A living goddess. How does that work?
So they choose these girls based on specific physical attributes and rituals.
Okay.
And they believe that the goddess Telaju actually enters the girl's body.
Wow. So what happens to the girl when she grows up?
Well, when she reaches puberty, it's believed that the goddess departs.
So she goes back to being a regular girl.
Yeah, but unfortunately, there's a lot of stigma attached to former Kumaris.
Oh, that's sad.
Yeah, people believe that bad luck will befall anyone who marries them.
So even though they're no longer considered divine,
right,
they still have to deal with the consequences of this belief system.
Exactly. It's a complex situation.
It really makes you think about the impact that traditions and beliefs can have on people's lives.
And it's not always doom and gloom when it comes to personal superstitions.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the source actually shares a funny story about the speaker's own mom.
Oh, okay.
So apparently their mom was really into fortune telling.
Mm-hmm.
And one day a fortune teller told her that the speaker should wear red underwear for good luck.
Red underwear? Interesting.
I know, right? And from that day forward, the mom insisted on buying the speaker red underwear.
Did it work? Did they have good luck?
Who knows? But it's just this funny example of how superstitions can persist even in people who consider themselves rational.
Totally. It's like those little rituals we all have. Yeah. Like my friend who always knocks on wood.
Exactly. It's like we're trying to trick fate into being on our side.
Right. Or like the source mentions, they actually used the Korean superstition about unlucky moving days.
Oh, yeah? That's clever.
To get cheaper rates when they were moving.
See? Sometimes you can use superstitions to your advantage.
So it's not all bad, but it all comes back to that fundamental question.
Yeah.
Why do we believe in this stuff? Why do superstitions endure?
The source suggests that it's because humans have this deep-seated need for stability and control.
Okay.
We want to believe that there's some order to the universe,
right,
even when things feel chaotic and unpredictable.
And superstitions give us that illusion of control.
Exactly. They provide explanations, even if those explanations aren't necessarily true.
It's like that saying, better safe than sorry, right?
Right. Even if a superstition seems silly, it's easier to just go along with it than to risk tempting fate.
So it's all about mitigating risk, even if that risk is just in our heads.
And let's not forget the power of stories.
Right. Stories shape how we understand the world.
Exactly. Like with the Curse of Pele, we tend to gravitate towards stories that confirm our beliefs, even if those stories are statistically insignificant.
And those stories are often more compelling.
Oh, yeah.
Than the dry facts and statistics.
It's like our brains are hardwired for a good narrative.
Totally. But it's important to be aware of that bias. To always be questioning and challenging our beliefs.
Exactly. That's how we avoid falling into those traps of superstition and misinformation.
And how we keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Right. Because in the end, it's all about understanding the world around us and ourselves. And that's a journey that never really ends.
Well said. And that's a great place to leave it for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but we've only just scratched the surface of this topic, so stay tuned for more.
Definitely. There's so much more to explore.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of superstitions. And until next time, remember, stay curious, stay critical, and keep those minds open.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Welcome back to our deep dive on superstitions. Before the break, we were talking about how important it is to question our beliefs.
Right.
And, it makes you wonder, with all the information overload we have today, are we really any less susceptible to superstitions than our ancestors were?
It's the question, isn't it? Like, we have all this technology and access to knowledge.
Right.
But those deep human desires and fears, they haven't gone anywhere.
Yeah, we might not consult oracles or sacrifice animals anymore, but have we really outgrown those superstitious impulses? I don't know.
I think in a lot of ways they've just evolved.
Yeah.
Like think about those personality quizzes that are all over social media. Are we really just trying to understand ourselves better?
Yeah.
Or are we looking for that same sense of certainty that ancient people found in the stars or...
That's an interesting point.
Yeah. Reading animal entrails.
Yeah, it's like we're still looking for external validation.
Totally.
Yeah.
And what about those online communities that are all about manifesting wealth or love?
Oh, yeah.
Is that any different from wishing on a shooting star?
It's like those same age-old desires.
Right.
Wealth, love, control over our destiny. They're just finding new outlets in the digital age.
Exactly. The tools and the language might be different.
Yeah.
But the underlying motivation is the same.
So it's like we're just replacing old rituals with new ones.
I think so.
Yeah.
And, another area where I see this happening is in the world of alternative medicine.
Okay. Yeah.
While there are definitely some practices that have scientific backing, there are also a lot that rely on anecdotal evidence or these kind of mystical claims that you can't really verify.
So are we basically falling for new forms of superstition?
I think it's possible.
Yeah.
It's a fine line, you know? You don't want to dismiss everything new,
all right,
but you also don't want to just blindly accept things without questioning them.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance between curiosity and skepticism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You have to ask questions, do your research, evaluate the information carefully.
And be willing to admit when you might be wrong.
Exactly. Because sometimes we think we know something for sure,
yeah,
and then we find out that we were totally off base.
That's happened to me more times than I care to admit.
Me too.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's actually a good thing, you know?
Okay, how so?
Because it reminds us that we're always learning and growing, and our understanding of the world is constantly evolving.
It's like this lifelong process of unlearning and relearning.
Exactly. And this whole deep dive has been about that, you know?
Yeah.
Exploring how our beliefs shape our understanding of the world, and how sometimes those beliefs can lead us astray.
And sometimes they can have really serious consequences, like we were talking about earlier with Chapati.
Right. That's why it's so important to have these conversations, you know?
Yeah.
To challenge harmful practices.
Right.
And to advocate for the well-being of all people.
It's about finding that balance between respecting cultural diversity and upholding universal human rights.
And I think a big part of that is empathy and understanding.
Okay.
Remember, superstitions often come from a place of fear or uncertainty.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So if we can approach those beliefs with compassion and a willingness to listen, then we can have more meaningful conversations and hopefully create some positive change.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to the heart of this whole deep dive. Understanding the nature of belief.
Right. From the silly and harmless to the potentially dangerous.
So what are your final thoughts for our listeners today?
I would say stay curious, stay critical, and be open to new perspectives. Don't be afraid to question your own beliefs.
Yeah.
And have those tough conversations with people who might see things differently.
And remember, the world is full of mysteries.
It is.
But we don't need to resort to superstition to explain them.
Well said.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from ancient rituals to modern myths. And I hope our listeners have come away with a better understanding of how powerful beliefs can be.
Me too.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I just want to thank everyone for joining us on this exploration.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Of the weird and wonderful world of superstitions. And until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep those minds open.
Absolutely. That's the best way to navigate this crazy world.
I completely agree. See you next time.
Welcome back to the show.
So before the break, we were talking about, you know, how important it is to be critical of what we believe.
Right.
And it makes you wonder, like, with all the information we have at our fingertips now, are we really any less prone to superstitions than people were, like, hundreds of years ago?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
We'd like to think we've come so far with science and technology.
Yeah.
But have we really outgrown those, you know, those basic human impulses that drive superstition?
Yeah, maybe we don't go to oracles anymore or sacrifice animals.
Totally.
But are we doing something similar with all these personality quizzes online?
Ooh, that's interesting.
Like, are we just looking for the same kind of reassurance that people used to get from the stars, or
well,
you know, like reading tea leaves?
I think you're right. We're still searching for those easy answers.
Yeah.
Some kind of external force to tell us who we are and what we should be doing.
And what about all those online communities that are dedicated to manifesting wealth or love? Is that any different from, you know, like wishing on a shooting star?
It's the same impulse, right? We crave certainty.
Yeah.
And we want to believe that we can control our own destiny.
And that some things are just meant to be.
Right. And it's not just limited to, you know, online stuff either.
Yeah.
Think about alternative medicine and all the wellness trends out there.
Okay.
Some of it has scientific backing.
Yeah.
But some of it is based on, you know, anecdotal evidence or these mystical claims that are hard to prove or disprove.
So how do we know what to believe?
Right.
When should we be open to new ideas and when should we be skeptical?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's about finding that sweet spot between curiosity and skepticism.
Yeah, right.
You want to be open-minded, but you also want to think critically. Ask questions.
Okay.
Do your research. Don't just take things at face value.
And be willing to admit when we're wrong, which can be hard.
Oh, it's so hard. But it's also how we grow and learn.
Yeah.
And that's what this whole deep dive has been about. You know,
Right.
Recognizing that our understanding of the world is always evolving.
And that we all have those little superstitions and biases that we might not even be aware of.
And that's okay. The important thing is to recognize them and to be willing to challenge them.
So we don't fall into those traps of misinformation and harmful beliefs.
Exactly. Like we talked about with chapati.
Right. The practice of banishing women from their homes during menstruation.
It's a reminder that even traditions and beliefs that are deeply rooted in culture can have really harmful consequences.
And that sometimes we need to question those traditions, even if it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. We speak up for what's right and advocate for the well-being of all people.
No matter what their beliefs are. Well said.
Thanks.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of superstitions, I just want to say thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this journey.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
It's been a fascinating exploration of how humans grapple with the unknown.
And how those beliefs shape our understanding of the world.
Exactly. So until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep those minds open
to new possibilities and new ways of thinking.
I love it. See you all next time.